Hello again. So in recent sessions we've been talking about policy to mitigation of climate change. That is, what sort of policies will reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. What we're going to talk to now in the next few sessions is about adaptation to climate change. So we're going to accept that there is climate change, and then the question is, how can society best plan to change its decisions and what we would call adapt to climate change? So the first point we might ask ourselves is climate change going to happen or not? And I think the answer is it definitely will. Even if we were to reduce greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, and I don't think there's any chance of that, but even if we did, scientific consensus is that the build-up of greenhouse gases over really the Industrial Revolution, the last few 100 years, and a whole lot of lags mean that climate change is going to keep evolving. We see this most clearly, I think, in ocean water that's just slowly absorbing greenhouse gases over decades, changing its temperature, changing the carbolic status of the water and so on, and those effects won't be felt for some time down the track. Of course, the more realistic story is that we expect to continue to produce more greenhouse gas emissions, and they're going to build up the stock from the current level of just over 400 parts per million. Why do I think that's going to happen? Well, it's going to take us a long time to develop a global agreement. We started way back in the early 1990s to try and make some progress. Kyoto really only worked for the large developed countries, and then they were really only going to reduce or hold their pollution at 1990 levels. And as we've seen on earlier sessions, trying to get all countries to join a global agreement is really a challenge. And so far, as we go through Copenhagen, Cancun, Durban, and so on, we see how challenging that is. And I think the reality is we do not realistically expect developing countries, such as your Chinas and Indias and Brazils and Indonesias, to just give up carbon pollution. They want to get their people out of poverty. And manufacturing and the use of electricity and energy are very important. And so whatever global agreement we come to, it seems to me highly likely we will allow the developing countries to do quite an amount of greenhouse gas pollution before they really seriously run it down to zero. Again, if we look at current strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, nobody really has a policy of saying by 2014, I will stop polluting completely. The more likely story is I'm going to reduce pollution by 2020. This is another 7 years down the track, by somewhere between 5 and 20%. And then maybe by 2050, I might reduce pollution to somewhere between 50 and 80% of current levels. So in between that period, we are putting more greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And this is really strengthened when we think of how governments who are serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions go about doing it. The reality is that not all sources of greenhouse gas emissions are in their target. In particular, we really don't know how to accurately and low cost measure pollution in the agricultural sector. It's still very expensive to measure pollution for small businesses. And so most pragmatic governments are going to leave considerable sources of pollution out of the net. And if we look at a country like New Zealand, about 60% of its greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. We're going to have to do an awful lot in terms of technology, science, and measurement costs before we can really bring everything into the net. And the real world is we live in a political environment. Democracies depend on getting 51% of the vote. Even dictatorships have to keep some of their people on side. And inevitably, governments make exemptions. And so, if we want an example, the European Emissions Trading Scheme covers only about 40% of its emissions. Australia, with its carbon price scheme, only covers 60% of its emissions. So when we add these things together, it's pretty clear that we're going to continue polluting, albeit at a lower rate, but still polluting. That adds to the global stock of pollution. So we're going to go from the current 400 parts per million at least to 450 parts per million, and maybe much, much higher. So that is almost certainly going to bring us climate change. So adaptation is about reducing the costs of climate change. What does that mean? Well, let's go back and just quickly summarise some discussions of a much earlier session. What are the costs of climate change? Well, one of it is that climate change means higher temperatures, and that means we have to change the way we provide personal comfort. And so if you think of keeping ourselves cool because it gets hotter, are we going to insulate our buildings? Are we going to run our air conditioning a little bit longer? Or are we going to put up with hotter temperatures? Well, the costs of adaptation is the changes in those decisions to keep ourselves comfortable. In terms of water availability, large parts of the globe, particularly in the middle latitudes, are likely to be both warmer and with less rainfall. That means that less water is going to run into our existing dams. So we're going to have to either build bigger dams or create manufactured water by desalination plants or recycling, or find ways of using water in a much more parsimonious way. These are what we would call adaptation costs of changing our current decisions. Again, there will be threats to the ecosystems and protection of our biodiversity. So we're going to have to change the way we run and operate our national parks if we want to protect all the unique flora and animals that we value so much. Our food production, agriculture, will be probably the most affected of all industries by climate change. Changes in rainfall, changes in temperature, changes in growing seasons. They're also going to affect diseases and pests. We're going to have to find smarter and different ways of producing our food, and that's an adaptation cost. Again, if the oceans rise, then we're going to get some inundation. That's going to force some population relocation, or we're going to have to put up barriers to higher sea levels. These are all forms of adaptation, and they're expensive. And of course, our health may well be threatened with changes in temperatures and humidity. The area where, for example, mosquitoes go, with all the nasty diseases they bring, will require us to spend more money on health prevention and on health treatment in many cases. So these are some of the things that all people in the globe, from the very rich to the middle income to the very poor, from one country to another, will have to do in the future. And of course, there'll be more damages to buildings with more severe weather events. So what's the basic economic problem as we see it? Well, as individuals, businesses and households, we have to choose how many products we want to buy and consume, so how much food, how much clothing, how much education and so on. We want to choose our production methods, how are we going to produce our energy, what sort of forms of agriculture are we going to use, and so on. And why do we do this? Well, we talk about maximising a measure of welfare, W, which depends on those goods and services. So the more food I have, the more education I have, the more entertaining stories I go to, the better I feel. Generally, I feel better if I've got better environmental outcomes like cleaner air, cleaner water, protection of plants and animals. I generally feel better if I know that my friends and even people in other parts of the world are also experiencing a nice income. And of course, I want safety, including from natural disasters. And the challenge of economics is we want more than we can possibly deliver. There are limitations. So there's a limited amount of natural resources, limited amount of land, of minerals, of energy, and of course climate is a major restraint. There's a limited amount of available labour and machines and equipment to help us in our production. Now, how effectively we use those natural resources and labour and machines depends very much on our technology, what we spend on research and development, and education. So the question is, how does climate change and adaptation fit into this game? Well, the really big deal is that climate change affects this first condition, the natural resources. It changes our climate. And it means we have to change our agriculture, the way we keep ourselves comfortable, how we handle rising sea levels, how we look after biodiversity. So adaptation is about how we best choose those decisions. So we have to modify and reduce the costs of climate change. And interestingly, decision changes are required by almost everybody, by every business, by every household, and by every government. Adaptation is not something that somebody else has to do. It's something that each and every person and each and every business will, to some extent, be involved. Of course, it'll be much more drastic for peasant farmers where there are major climate changes than somebody who lives in a comfortable university. But even the person in the university will be tied up with handling changes in temperatures and feeling comfortable. We may have to restructure our buildings because of greater adverse weather events and so on. And so what's really critical about all this is that there's a large and major role for research and development to help us find and make better decisions in the context of climate change. So yes, climate change is going to change the environment in which we make decisions. Those decision changes will be adjusted. That's what adaptation's about. In one sense, that's a challenge. In the other sense, it's a wonderful opportunity. And you, the students, the citizens of the future, this is one of the things that's going to be on your exciting agenda.